Thanks. Welcome, everyone. And welcome to those who are joining us online. My name is Alia Dawood. I'm an associate at Aeon Collective, a Saudi Waqf, with a mission of enhancing dialogue and harnessing discussions to advance cooperation and efforts towards sustainable development. I'm delighted to introduce our next session, entitled Climate Change Solutions, Economic and Social Components of Policymaking. This will be an interactive session that will discuss the economic and social impacts of climate change and challenges surrounding mitigation efforts. We will also explore the notion of a just transition for Saudi Arabia that aligns with the Paris Agreement objective. Moderating the session are Aeon Collective's co-founders, Princess Noura bint Turki and Princess Masha'al al-Sha'lan. Hand it over to you.
Thank you, Alia. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. We have Princess Nouf bint Mohammed, CEO of the King Khalid Foundation, Mr. Fahad Alajlan, President of the King Abdullah Center for Petroleum Studies, KAPSARC, and Ms. Isa Kavital, CEO Director of the International Climate Politics Hub. We've also, joining us later on would be Madame Tubiana, as soon as she's done with her session. So maybe we'll start from the international perspective. Isabella, maybe we'd like you to, we've come a long way since Paris. There was a lot of baggage pre-Paris, and kind of Paris reset the dynamics around climate diplomacy and climate action. Could you please start with an overview around that international dimension, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Princess, and thank you for your kind invitation. Thank you also all for attending. It's a pleasure being here. So yes, I think internationally, frankly, we are living paradoxical times. When you think of it, those of us who were involved in getting the Paris Agreement done, we would have think what is happening today is unthinkable. We've never seen so much action, almost virtually the entire G20, where most of the expectations are placed because of their emissions, has now a net zero target, including the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So we'll hear more about that for sure. And that is quite outstanding. We have breakthroughs throughout sectors that we thought unimaginable back then. So definitely the Paris Agreement's adoption and the pull that it's had in the economy globally is quite impressive. It's quite striking, and it's very positive. And I think we need to recognize that. At the same time, and I said we are living in paradoxical times, because at the same time, and both are true, we are very far from where we need to be. We know, as per the latest science, that all of that seems enormous is still very far away from the reductions that we need to get to the Paris goals, especially to remain within the safe space of not allowing temperature to go up more than 1.5 degrees. So those two are both true, and those two parallel truths are currently, I think, coexisting in the international space and impacting quite significantly. You can see it here at COP26, impacting the geopolitical dynamics of what we are seeing. You've seen in this first week, leaders coming, being honest with, for example, not having yet met the 100 billion promises, not being there yet on emissions reductions commitments for 2030 to get to the 1.5. So that honesty is important, is highlighting we're not there yet. And at the same time, this first week, we've seen a ton of announcements happening that show that we are indeed making quite significant progress. So this is unfolding throughout COP26, and I think it's a broader dynamic. It is also going to be the case, I think, next week. And for me, when you think about it from an international perspective, if we are going to have progress, we need to precisely do those both things with COP26. We need to recognize we're not there yet and provide the world with a message of hope that we will do the unimaginable, right? As what happened in Paris, it was unimaginable and we did it. We need to do that yet again and again and again until we get to 1.5. And that message of hope and acceleration is core to COP26 delivering what it needs to deliver at these paradoxical times. And it needs to say the truth. It needs to tell the world where we actually are. And it needs to be honest about that. I think that's currently where we are. And I would be more than happy to start an interaction. One thing that I think is going to be central to that debate is the issue of climate justice. We know that communities, countries, let alone countries, but communities within countries experience climate change in very different ways. And they're going to need to be pathways that are diverse to get to the same goals, while our direction, the sense of direction and the pathway broadly needs to be similar, while the just transition for those very vulnerable communities is ensured. That's one sense of climate justice that needs to be we need to bear in mind. And the second one that is often forgotten is the issue of climate justice across generations, is how we are going to share the burden of the cost of climate change. Because sometimes we feel it's just a question of geography. Some countries are richer, some countries are poorer, some communities are richer, some are poorer, and we believe climate justice is just about this. But climate justice is also about the impacts of climate and who is going to pay for the cost that the transition will have. The transition will have a cost. And the more we delay that transition, the costlier it will be. So it is about how we are splitting the cost over time in generations that will provide actual justice, also in terms of preventing the impacts and actually who's paying for that transition, because it will have a cost and we need to be honest about it. So I think that sort of cross section of that paradoxical time that I mentioned is climate justice, and the three sort of angles of the triangle are very core to what we are seeing unfold here at COP26.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And it's a good segue into our next panelists. Should you hear me well? I absolutely agree with you. I think just thinking about climate action, we need to consider the transitional risk as well as the physical risks, and that balance between short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning is really one of the biggest challenges as nations try to figure out how to address that. And I think coming to Saudi Arabia, the kingdom has come a long way since its first NDCs in 2015. And I think there's been a lot of progress since then with the announcement of Vision 2030, which is our national strategy for diversification, for economic and social development. And that kind of laid a new narrative for the kingdom and also for society as a whole, right? And the kingdom has looked at, it's looking at its wealth and its natural resources in a different way and trying to think of ways of how can we continue to benefit from our resources while at the same time diversifying our economy, improving the quality of lives of civilians in the kingdom, and also contributing to climate action and environmental prosperity. Very recently, there's been the Saudi Green Initiative that was announced in the Middle East Green Initiative, where there was an announcement for a net zero target by 2060. And this announcement and this target is really has been guided by the Circular Carbon Economy Framework, which was announced in 2019 by His Royal Highness the Minister of Energy. And since then, there has been a lot of work in the lead up to the SGI by KAPSARC, by the Ministry of Energy. And I'd like, Mr. Fahad, I'd like you to talk about how the work around the Circular Carbon Economy Framework has evolved since 2019 and where we are right now in terms of the policies and initiatives, both short-term, I would say, to reach our new NDCs by 2030, but also what is the long-term kind of strategy of the kingdom to really hone in on the potential of the Circular Carbon Economy Framework?
Thank you, Your Highness. Last week was a historic week for the kingdom, both the doubling of the NDC targets for 2030 and then the announcement of the net zero ambition by 2060. I think a lot of this would not have been possible without the Circular Carbon Economy Framework, the circular carbon economy framework, which was launched in 2019, was just a concept at that time. And during the presidency of the G20, Saudi's presidency of the G20, it was further enhanced. And then the CCE national program was launched. And a lot of discussion happened, whether in kingdom or outside the kingdom, with a lot of think tanks, a lot of participant companies and private sector, as well as non-profit organization. The circular carbon economy's focus is basically touching on what was achieved in Paris, which is the common but differentiated responsibility, and taking into account the national circumstances. That a country like Saudi is very different than a country like Iceland. A country like Australia is very different than a country like the UK. And they have different paths to net zero. They have different paths for managing the emission. The beauty of the circular carbon economy is that it focuses on so many technologies, but it has these 4 pillars: the reduce, which we understood it has been done since for the past 40 years about how can we reduce emissions, but also equally the reuse, the recycle, and the remove. How can we reuse and recycle CO2 to create value out of this, not view it as a negative externality, and then finally, how can we remove it from the atmosphere? And the focus on these, for informed a lot of the Saudi Green Initiative, but also the Middle East Green Initiative. When we talk about, changing the energy mix to focus on incorporating 50% renewable, that's part of this. Reducing, liquid burn and replacing it with gas, which is transition fuel, a much cleaner fuel. That's another, initiative. When we're talking about hydrogen and producing 4 million tons of hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen, both blue and green, we're talking about another, cross-cutting initiative. And finally, when we're talking about CCUS, we're talking about launching the biggest CCUS hub in Jubail, but also I think bringing a lot of these, initiative towards a regional platform. During the Middle East Green Initiative, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and launched a $10 billion fund with Saudi commitment to fund 15% of that would help in accelerating a lot of the technologies that, different scenarios, different, outlooks look at and say that, we have enough technology to get us to 2030, 2040 targets, but to get us to net zero by 2050 and 2060s, a lot of these technologies are not yet developed or commercially scaled. So how can we get that? And so the technology part of the CCE is very important because CCE is basically technology agnostic. And so what we're saying is, it doesn't matter what technology you can use to help manage your emission, you should be able to use it. You should not be just focused on one bucket. There is no silver bullet. All of them we want to do. But more importantly is also, what does this mean on the economic and social front? Because that's important as well. And as my fellow panelist, Isabella mentioned, making sure that, there is justice, there is equality when it comes to this transition is very important. And when you're looking at, developing economies versus developed, it's important that, the cost is, shouldered evenly and equitably between the two. And the same thing within societies, different segments of society. Today, if you look at the US, which is a rich economy, 1/3 of households, struggle to pay their energy bills. This is, a rich country. Forget about, countries in Africa that, if you're looking at, for example, electrification, today, a country like Congo, an average per capita that gets electricity, consumes 100 kilowatt. In the US, Canada, South Korea, a lot of the developed economies, we're talking about 10,000 kilowatts. So 100-fold increase in the consumption of electricity. So whatever energy transition we're speaking about, we need to talk about, both the economic as well as the social part of that equation and that transition. And that's why we believe in the CCE. We believe that the CCE is very economic. We've seen this. Yesterday, we showed a scenario for circular carbon economy to achieve net zero that was developed by KAPSARC. And it showed that it's very much more equitable than a scenario that only focuses on, exclusive technology that focuses on the reducing emissions. And so that is, I think, important for us.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to come back to the point on financing CCE technologies, and also dig a little deeper into the policies, the local policies that will be deployed and how they'll impact particularly small and medium-sized industries and society, the lower, more vulnerable segments of society. But before so, maybe we can move to Princess Nouf and you at the King Khalid Foundation are focused a lot on intergenerational equity, which Isa just mentioned earlier, but also looking at local, today, how these policies will impact, or existing policies, newly announced policies, how are they currently impacting vulnerable communities, and what policy recommendations you have for the government and for policymakers to support these communities, whether it's today or in the long term as more policies come along.
As a foundation in Saudi, the social aspect of climate change, the Green Initiative, all the policies that will come out of it is very important to us, because what we do is we work on, especially in our policy and advocacy program, is on the social protection system. And within our other programs, it's creating equal opportunities. And as you said, in 2019, we issued a study called Intergenerational Equity. So we do, as Isabella just mentioned, look at climate effects on generations to come. So we look at the water systems, we look at the green cover, we look at desertification, we look at all these different aspects and how they affect generations now and generations to come, and what these policies or changes in policies will do. And I think what is very interesting in our context is that sometimes the government initiatives are way ahead of different social businesses and different CEOs back home, private businesses. The government is really driving this. So one of the things the government has done, and I think it was spearheaded, I know, by the Minister of Energy, to mitigate changes in policy, like when they removed some of the subsidies over gas and electricity, was creating the citizens account. And these were basically cash transfers. And this program worked exceedingly well. And we think we need to see more of that, especially on the most vulnerable segments of society. And this mitigated the effects, and they were quite generous even in the segments that were covered by these cash transfers. The other thing also is that we look at it again through the spectrum of social organizations around the world, and what climate change and what policy means to them. And again, what we see is that it is some of the solutions are not equitable. What happens again, as you said, in one country does not equate to what happens in the other. And most interestingly, the people that are most affected negatively by climate are the people that will be harmed mostly by all the mitigating or the new policies that are coming up. So this is something we really need to look at.
Thank you very much. And maybe a good segue into our online panelist, Mr. Rudolph. I'd like to introduce Rudolph Lohmeyer, who's a partner at Kearney, and he had played a significant role in working on the Vision 2030 strategy and has been involved in the National Transformation Plan. So Rudolph, maybe you've heard our panelists speak about their expertise and their work. Perhaps you can talk about how the National Transformation Plan is really looking at and bringing all of these different components together and addressing these challenges as well as opportunities.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be with you, an honor to be with you, and to hear the comments of my fellow panelists, which are so brilliant and on point, and actually quite rare to hear. If I may, just as an introduction to this question about the plan itself, I think the lenses that are required to really understand the importance of the plan are sort of threefold. The first is a policy lens, and the thing that's so often neglected by those who don't do policy for a living, which is policy precision. And then the second is this lens of people, of individual people and the communities in which they live, and the impact of the transition that's so necessary on them. And then I think the third is the geopolitical layer and understanding all of that. And at the risk of being a little bit too dramatic, I'd like just to frame all of that by saying that when it comes to this issue, this most urgent of all challenges of addressing climate change, I think that the naivete that informs so much of the debate is not just not practical, but it's actually destructive. And it's destructive because Naivete is, of course, all about not seeing into the depths of an issue. And that's the policy lens that I'd like to refer to. And I think that's the policy lens that the strategy seeks to take into account. By policy precision, it means not thinking in terms of broad global abstractions. And as the panelists have said so articulately, it means distinguishing between the impacts in terms of the layers of society, the type of country, geography, political system, communities, and individuals, and that by not doing that, by thinking in terms of big, broad global abstractions and unitary solutions, there's a huge and grave risk of causing huge suffering precisely on those that the policies are intended to help, as other panelists have so articulately indicated, but also, and that's where we migrate to geopolitics, to also destabilizing the ability of the world to come to a consensus on this. I had the privilege of advising a European foreign ministry after Copenhagen, and they brought me in after the fact to say, it went very badly. Could you please meet with our team? And we'd like you to give us a presentation on it. And by the way, even though I trained in political science under John Mearsheimer, the famous hardcore realist, I'm really not. In many ways, I'm an idealist. I just would like to disclose. Having said that, the lens of realism is so important, even from an ethical standpoint, because the fact is that if you don't consider that every country has its interests, its requirements, and that we have to make this adjustment together, and if you try to impose a single solution on all countries, you will destabilize the consensus, which will derail progress. And that's a very, very real prospect. And so now back to the solution. So what does it mean? If we have a world in which individual communities around the world have to not only be thought of in terms of the impact of climate change, but the impact of the transition. We know how difficult financing that will be, and a lot of that good work is happening. So that's that lens. And then the geopolitical lens, we realize countries are in different positions, have different assets to contribute. Then what are the strategic implications? And that's why the clear strategic implication, particularly for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in my humble opinion, but also more broadly, is the importance of innovation, and especially innovation that focuses on removing carbon from the atmosphere, which of course is, from the perspective of scenario planning, which is my primary analytic discipline, the most robust solution available. It's not the only one. The entire spectrum is required, but the toolkit that the Kingdom has built and is in the process of implementing, and the commitments that it's recently made, basically convert a terrible problem into an opportunity for the Kingdom, an opportunity to apply its investment resources to accelerate innovation in ways that, of course, allow it to address its own internal issues, but also become the platform for solutions for the world. As Bill Gates has emphasized, as Rajan has emphasized, we need to accelerate innovation. That requires not just talking about it, it requires investment, to which the Kingdom has committed to a remarkable degree, and it requires experimenting in real life with it. For the Kingdom, of course, it represents an economic opportunity, green and blue hydrogen, for example, but all of the technologies going into CCUS and direct air capture have huge promise, and that's just as it should be. So let me just conclude by saying that for a country that has investable resources and a very specific set of national requirements, as one of the universe of countries with their diverse interests, I think the strategy hinges in a way that's not just best for the Kingdom, but actually is the most complementary contribution to the global solution that we need. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rudolph. That was fantastic. And just to touch on a point you mentioned, you spoke about policy precision, and that's absolutely important, but it's also important for these policies or cross industry policies to be coherent, right? And also reliable over the long term. But at the same time, giving the volatile energy markets, volatile global economy, one also must be, I would say, nimble and able to adapt to different changes and respond to changes in the global system. Could you speak a little bit about that and how the Kingdom strategy is in fact addressing the challenges and the dynamics that are happening on the global scale as it deploys its national transformation plan?
Right, the adaptive capacity. I think, first of all, to my knowledge, there's not another country that is investing so much in building a policy framework that involves the continuous monitoring of impacts and results and its adaptation. So part of the reason why so many of us are here doing the work that we do is because it's sort of this laboratory of government innovation like no other. on Earth. But in particular, I think that the initiatives, the announcements that have been made, because they hinge on experimentation with innovation and with technology, they are by definition adaptive, and in particular, they're practical because it's a diversified portfolio of initiatives. It's not just one. It's not a single bet on one technology. But as my dear friend was describing in more detail, there's a systematic portfolio. And of course, that's the ultimate source of resilience in a strategy of this kind. And in any kind of R&D effort that's serious, is to have not so much diversity that all the investments are shallow and yield no results, like the famous 1,000 wells 3 feet deep don't capture any water. So you can't make that mistake. But on the other hand, to be adaptive to your question, then having a diversified portfolio of experiments, each of them with a high likelihood but not guaranteed success to be economically viable, is, I think, the most adaptive approach. And the strategy very much reflects that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn back to Mr. Alajlan. I'd like to speak about some of the policies that you'll be, that the Kingdom is looking at to deploy to ensure that a lot of our practices, particularly industries, are practicing cleaner technologies, or adopting or deploying cleaner technologies, right? Whether it's particularly when it comes to steel and cement. And if we think about hydrogen, for example, for heat, this may happen in the next 6 years, 10 years, depending on how the technology develops and depending how it's being deployed. But I'd like to maybe talk a little bit more on the short term. What policies are being discussed in order to support these industries to transition from their current practices to more, to cleaner practices?
So I think it's very important that, walk before you learn to run. And so if you look at, for example, the policy toolkit that was implemented for households, it was a very gradual process. So it started with efficiency, it started with mandating installation for homes, and then going into appliances, getting that efficiency to improve, and then going to cars and having the first, cafe outside, any of the OECD countries, and then finally getting to, price reform. And so you have to have this, gradual policy implementation. You cannot go for the, the hard policy before you implement the soft policy. If you look at, for example, some of the sectors that we're talking about, cement, steel, in one term, they're heavy industry. So they benefit from the same technology. But in others, they're very different. If you look at, for example, the cement sector, the cement is a very non-tradable sector. Yes, it is heavy industry, but most of the consumption is done regionally. So if you look at the export from Saudi for cement, it's very minimal compared to the domestic market. And so implementing any policy, especially when it comes to making sure that you do a lot of, the reducing the emissions and making sure that you transition those industries into cleaner, will be borne mostly by the domestic household. On the other hand, if you look at some of the other, like aluminum, petrochemical, a lot of these are actually export-oriented industry. And so there is a market, again, it's not a big market, but there is some market for a premium low carbon product that you can actually take into account when you're producing a lot of these products. So we need to differentiate, even though the toolkit when it comes to technology is the same, there are differences when it comes to policy and the impact, and so how you do it. So I think the first focus has been on efficiency. And so there has been the Saudi Energy Efficiency Center have introduced specific, efficiency standards for heavy industry, whether this is petrochemical, cement, and steel. Now, the second, focus is how do you actually get a lot of these, companies to implement some of these, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's CCUS, that would actually reduce their CO2 footprint. And if you look at this, I think the focus should be on a lot of, the tradable sector, the tradable industry that is able to export, able to, withstand the added cost of, managing their emission, rather than going for a cement sector, for example, that is very domestically driven, that would impact, have a much bigger impact on households, on, housing. Saudi has has expanded significantly when it comes to financing for housing. And so you want to make sure that these impacts are absorbed. It doesn't mean that in the long term, you shouldn't, evolve and adopt these. But I think the first policy is always, going for efficiency. After that, you go for the technology driven, whether it's CCUS or hydrogen. And I think, given the Saudi cost for producing hydrogen or the Saudi cost for CCUS, we're talking about a huge advantage for Saudi when it comes, for example, to producing, low carbon steel or low carbon aluminum or low carbon ammonia. And I think that's, where Saudi would be excelling. If you look at, today, if you look at the supply chain, the global supply chain, it's very focused on cost and ability to manufacture. I think in 20 years, 15 to 20 years, we're going to be looking at a very different and changed supply chain that will incorporate some kind of a price of carbon and the ability to abate these emissions. And how can you do that?
Thank you very much. The kingdom has, as it embarked on its circular carbon economy strategy, and as well, maybe before that, Aramco's work on exporting blue hydrogen or ammonia to Japan has really involved or required a lot of international collaboration, right? And I think the kingdom, as a hydrocarbon producer and exporter, has very strong alliances with global partners such as the US, for example, but also Japan as an energy consumer, right? And I think that in of itself, these strong collaborations and cooperations between nations will really, pragmatic ones, I would say, are really moving action and pragmatic actions or inclusive actions toward climate mitigation. And on that note, I'd like to move back to you, Isabel, and get your thoughts on what you've heard right now and some of these collaborations. And perhaps you have some questions or comments regarding that.
Thank you, Your Highness, and thank you for all of those very interesting remarks on sort of the details of the plan that is coming up. That's very welcome to hear that. When I think of this in the context that I was mentioning at the beginning of never having been so advanced and at the same time never having been so far from where we need to be, I feel that it's important to remind ourselves that the only real judge is our atmosphere. It is our atmosphere. That is the judge, right? And so we know in science nowadays that there is a limit on setting which we can rely on technology development, and that there will come a point, and it's actually probably already now, and of drawing the plan has brought these kinds of decisions where local decision making, economic policy decision making will involve situated trade-offs, right? That are difficult to solve, in the local context and in the global context. And these situated decisions that are difficult include a very challenging, let's say, position for countries like Saudi Arabia or like my own country, Colombia, that are fossil exporters, right? And they're challenging because they mean that very core industries for local economies will need to change quite drastically. And so I think it's important to bear that in mind, and it's important to know that we don't have endless time. Global emissions need to be reduced this decade. We don't need to be just offsetting. We need to reduce them in half this decade, and the only judge is the atmosphere. So that implies those situated decisions I meant that are necessarily challenging. And for a climate justice perspective to occur, those trade-offs will need to be explicit and addressed with honesty, in the sense that obviously some industries will have more challenges than others. But I'm very pleased to see that Madame Tubiana is here. So I'm sure you will want to give her a warm welcome.
Thank you very much for joining, Madame Tubiana. Welcome. Maybe I can start by giving you an overview of what we just discussed in a quick minute. So we touched on the issue of intergenerational equity. We touched on the issue of social justice and how this varies across different countries and regions. We also dug a bit deeper into Saudi Arabia's commitments to net zero and how the circular carbon economy framework is is really guiding it towards that commitment. And one key pillar of that, which Mr. Fahad touched on, is the 10 billion fund to fund the technologies necessarily, particularly a focus on hydrogen and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. But also there's the market mechanism component. Mr. Fahad, you haven't spoken a lot about that, but maybe there's something you can elaborate on a little more. But these are the different topics that we touched on. Obviously, an overarching component of all of this is the Vision 2030, which is Saudi's diversification strategy, and how the National Transformation Plan is allowing the kingdom to really address all of its different challenges through building on the opportunities and its competitive advantage, right? Of a young society, of a rich country, and of this just dynamic time that we all live in, right? And so maybe we can get your quick reflections or comments from the international perspective and your work since Paris, and how the discussion has evolved really over the past years. And I think we've seen a lot of countries step up to their commitments with their new NDCs, but also beyond the NDCs, longer term commitment.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. And before just sharing my perception and from the evolution from 2015 to now, I would like to congratulate both of you for the extraordinary work you are doing with A1 Collective. It's wonderful to see you young women so committed to climate agenda. Now it's many years we are talking together, and I'm so happy to see you flourishing with your initiative, and I'm very honored, of course, to be part of this very important panel. So, of course, when I look back these 6 years, I could have, in a way, mixed sentiment, no? Because global emission have been rising still, and we are still, of course, not on the right track. On the other side, of course, and we have seen finally the utility of this, importance of this COP after 5 years, where we have seen the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement of US, and of course, hopefully, if they're coming back. We have seen the COVID crisis, and so we have lost years. But I see now a momentum of remobilization, and of course, the announcement of Saudi Arabia is a very, very good example. I would not have bet when I remember negotiating with your with the delegate, with Saudi ambassador. It was really the last moment of the negotiation of the global goal of Paris and net zero by 2050 or around that, and the idea that we need really to have this long-term strategy. Of course, I would not have bet that this year, this COP26, I would have seen this achievement. So it's, I think, a very big step forward. It signals that all countries have now begun to understand the gravity of the climate crisis, which is not, of course, for tomorrow, which was already there. I think that this, of course, that the way the change happened, because people in governments and economic actors and society recognize that we cannot delay. The issue, of course, is how we get there. And it is why from now to the next year, we need an intensive conversation on how we make this plan implemented. And because this will, I've been talking to you as students, so how the trust building is so central. Every country has to trust that the other will go, because it's an adventure. Nobody knows exactly the road. And to do that, I think the best way is to share experiences and to be as transparent as possible, because that will build the trust that was so strong in Paris and that we need to recover between developing countries and developed one, the oil exporting countries and the other ones. So that's why I think it's a very interesting period. I'm sure your activity, your foundation, your think tank would deliver that, the advice to the Saudi Arabia leaders. And so maybe the key word for this COP is really taking stock of all these good announcements. We have a good announcement on coal phasing out. We have a good announcement of, for example, the end of export credit on fossil fuels. We have all these more than, I don't know the number now, the 100 and more, 15 or 16 or 18 net zero 2050 countries plans. And so if we now say, okay, that's good, we are in the right direction. Let's now talk about the details and how we implement that and how we really get this done. And of course, in your country particular, you know, for the potential of renewable energy, we have been discussing that many times. It's absolutely enormous. To change the base of the economy is not easy. Isa was saying that for Colombia, but many other countries. I remember a discussion with my good friends and colleagues in Venezuela and other countries. And I think that's right. That's important to find a new source of job and wealth in a new economy, which is finally the challenge we are all facing. So, and I think your country as well, because of this enormous capacity of investment, not only internally, but externally. You are a driver of many, when I look at all the countries where your country is investing, you could be a force for driving clean energy development. And that would be, of course, a new role for Saudi Arabia. And switching from, well, the traditional role to a totally new one and showing leadership on that. But I'm sure, and of course, happy to respond to all the specific question on the COP, but I really trust your energy to push for that.
Thank you very much, Madam Tubiana. It's truly an honor to have you here with us today and a pleasure to see you again after such a long time. Just touching on your comments, you did mention investing in clean energy. Today, for example, we've heard a lot and there were commitments on phasing out coal, but also there's been a lot of talk on sustainable finance. And I think there's some sort of dissonance when it comes to that discussion, because you have those who are arguing for sustainable finance to focus as much as possible on renewables, and then those who look at a more inclusive approach to sustainable finance, right, where there will be a continuation for the hydrocarbon economy, but a clean hydrocarbon economy, right, focused on specific technologies such as hydrogen, regardless of its color, and also carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and other efficiency, I would say, measures. And so I think here that's where the challenge is, or I think where the debate has to happen, right, is how can we make the discussion around green finance or sustainable finance be more inclusive and not create that kind of confusion, especially when communicating with the general public, right? That the focus should be on the end goal, on the emissions. And again, if we don't have that pragmatic approach or that pragmatic discussion that really speaks to the different nature or circumstances of different countries, such as the Kingdom, for example, versus some other country that is let's say, resource poor and prefers to focus on more renewable resources, then I think we're always going to be stalling or reach a wall because of these barriers. And I think this pragmatism and discussion would really lend to what you were speaking about just now and what you just mentioned about building more trust, right? And trusting one another and ensuring that, okay, we are going to have this pragmatic discussion. We are going to have dig deeper into what we need to do and how we can collaborate in a way that we are ensuring that we are all working towards our end goal, but at the same time, we are able to do it in a way that each nation and each country can do it in a way that works to its own benefit and aligned with its own development trajectory. And I think to that point, maybe I invite our panelists and speakers to actually have a dynamic discussion. I think there's a lot of comments. I'm sure, Princess Nouf, you have some comments on all of this. And then Mr. Fahad, maybe between yourself and Madame Tubiana, speaking about the international finance component of these specific technologies for the Kingdom specifically, but also for the international community, for the global South and all their energy needs and requirements. And there's a lot to speak about there because particularly in the global South, because they're starting from such a low base, I think there's huge potential to deploy clean and renewable technologies there. So again, the focus shouldn't be on a specific technology or a specific approach, but really what fits within the landscapes of given regions.
Can I add to that? I think what equally needs to happen with building trust is transparency and rigor and quantification and open data. So also beyond that, how can we leverage those kinds of tools to ensure that we're walking the talk and we're actually meeting our intended targets?
If I may be like the non-understanding person here or the pedestrian here among the experts, the dialogue is all the time hearing is very complicated, shall I say, and there's no role for the individual. It's quite technology intensive. And I think maybe also in Saudi Arabia, we're in a different situation, unique, that the approach is top down and not bottom up. There hasn't been that demand from the bottom to make the changes. I mean, most were what, 70% under 35? So most people don't know the difference between the climate. And what I saw yesterday was really terrifying. I thought, okay, I'm just going to stay in bed. I can't do anything. But it really shows you how dangerous the situation is, and how also the dialogue must change. If you're going from top up and heavy industry, we need to see the role of small, medium-sized businesses and the role of the individual to make it more, I wouldn't say appealing, but to get the buy-in. And I think what you see a lot in media, I don't mean to be not too nice to the media, but you see you see two sides that don't want to meet. And when I'm here and I hear the slow transition, there is a big area for discussion that needs to be brought forward to people. And then if I go back to top down, you're talking about heavy industry, but what is taking place for medium-sized businesses again? We have different standards now that are being, I would say, introduced but not applied. GRI, for instance. And I think where the problem comes in, sustainability is a big issue for a legacy issue at the foundation, where we've been driving for. But when they are not enforced, and I think where governments have issues is from the pressures, or let's say negative externalities that come to them from all other sides. So if we can push this aside, I think it's very easy for governments to have that. But you need to think of the individual also, and that maybe is the case for us, to have them be part of the discussion, to understand what's going on. And I don't know if the ministry or KAPSARC has taken that into consideration in the policies. And we're very excited about the Saudi Green Initiative. And we see that there's something we can do. We still don't know what it is. It has not been made, I haven't seen a clear roadmap. I've seen the targets. And I wonder if you will be talking about these or introducing to the public what the roadmap is and where people can be part of this change.
Thank you, Your Highness. I think, again, yes, I agree with you that most of this has been top down, but I think given that Saudi is one of the countries where there is a concentration of heavy industries, whether we're talking about oil and gas and petrochemical, and most of these are dominated by large population, not SMEs, that the focus has been mostly on the low-hanging fruit, which are those heavy industries. I think when it comes to involvement of the youth and involvement of the, having a bottom-up approach, I think the Saudi Green Initiative, for example, there was a day that focused on the youth summit. And I think a lot of it was introducing a lot of the young people to this concept about issues about climate, issues about, transition, issues about, how do you actually look at this and the impact. And so I think there is work that has been done. I think for us at KAPSARC, for example, we have a lot of publication, whether, they go from research into just, simple insight that talks about, current event, what is happening. And a lot of it is, focused on this. And so, for example, yesterday, we launched the Circular Carbon Economy Index, which is a way of ranking countries when it comes to their implementation of climate approach that related to the circular carbon economy. I agree that it's technology heavy and it's jargon heavy. But I think, this is just the nature of the discussion that has happened, because up till like maybe Paris, this was a discussion that has been dominated by technicians and politicians. It hasn't been a discussion that has been, dominated, especially in a country that is, I would say, have, more, I think, on the, development side rather than, a developed economy. I think Saudi is lucky that, people have access to energy. And so that's energy poverty is not an issue overall, that the policy of the government that you've discussed, the citizen account, the cash payback, and so on, the tiered electricity tariff has been able to protect to a certain degree most of the vulnerable population from a lot of which have been happening over the past decade, whether it's energy price reform or energy efficiency targets and so on. I think when it comes, to maybe the discussion around international finance, I think this is one of the biggest area of disappointment. I think there are post-Paris there has been, expectation about a lot of, help going into developing economies that has not materialized. But I think, again, there has been a very dogmatic focus on what clean energy and what a clean transition looks like. If you look at the US today, for example, the US emissions peaked in 2005, and I think their emissions today are down by 25%. Most of that happened because of shale gas. Yet, if you're trying to finance any, for example, transition from coal to gas today in any of the developing economies that would need to do the same thing, you probably would not get international finance for it. And so for me, that's a missed opportunity. Why are we, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think we should look at what is good enough that we can actually implement. And there will be winners and losers. Any, transition that happens, whether it was the Industrial Revolution back in this, 17th century, the 20th century, all transitions have winners and losers. The most important thing is how do you protect the winners and losers? How do you protect the losers and make sure that, they're not vulnerable? And how do you design your policy to actually minimize this and make sure it is equitable, whether it's between, segments of society, whether it's between different countries or between different generations. And I think that's what's important when you're designing policy and making sure that you keep all of these, very visible when you're designing policy.
Of course, you are tackling a very, very important discussion. And if I may, I would say it's good to shift from a defensive position to a position where if we want, and again, that's not my take, but I can totally understand yours. And it's good to have the conversation that if we want the gas in particular to be kept in the energy mix of the 30s, 40s, we have to make the proof that we can really invest seriously in carbon capture and sequestration. And for the moment, this is appearing in the models just to close the loop, but it's not really applied in reality. So that, in a way, my take on new plea for sustainable finance. And I think that would change the discussion if we had, in a way, made the proof of the concept that we are able, both on the technology side, and it's true, it's very technology heavy, but at the same time, on the way to finance it, with a carbon price or something else that makes the, with the profitability of the carbon capture there. Europe has discussed CCS for many years. I think we have maybe one pilot, maybe two, I don't remember. US has one company doing it. So yes, you're right. For the moment, the switch from coal to gas has been beneficial for US emissions, and it will be anyway. Any country moving from coal to gas will have the same benefit. The problem is that we have started very late. And that the problem is, again, that could have been a much softer transition if we had, I'm in this business of climate since too long, 30 years more, just too long. Could be the grandmother of many, many young people and negotiators. But so I think because of that, we have to check with the science and the carbon budget left. So I would say the main argument for really, and again, that in a way is that your job, because you have to defend your stance or your economic model. And I understand you want as well to invest in the clean energy, which is, I think, very useful because you have the capacities technically and from the capital point of view. But really, we have to make the CCS story serious. We cannot put that as a number to say, oh yeah, but we will put it at the end, it will be okay. That's not serious. When you look at IEA models, which in the beginning, you take them 2 or 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, the solution was always, oh, we will have a lot of carbon capture and sequestration. That's fine if it exists. That doesn't fine. It is not fine if it doesn't exist. So in a way, I think I have had discussion with many of your colleagues when going to your country or in the outskirts of the COPs. That maybe for me, I don't know, for other oil exporting countries that really want to achieve that, and now you have a target. I think that's very important proof. you can bring. And that maybe change the discussion. We not only will need, if we listen to IPCC, to have CCS as an important element, but to be net negative. So we will be able to extract the carbon from the atmosphere after 2050 at the latest. So, you know, that's a big challenge. And in a way, that's a big opportunity for you as a country. So anyway, that's my way to respond to, it's not a, it will be pragmatic when it's real, if I may say so.
Absolutely agree with you. And I think maybe using the example of hydrogen is a good testament to that, because you do need political will, you need the policies that actually make things that are not maybe seen as economically viable or the best solutions viable, because of I think that's basically what is needed. And Rudolph, I see you, you raised your hand.
Yes, I did. Thank you so much. I just want to be brief. I've never met Madame Tubiana, but I just would like to passionately endorse what she said. I think it's so important. So I think no single country can actually achieve what we need to achieve with carbon capture and even direct air capture by itself. But of course, those that lead the way have to be those with the resources to do so, which is what impresses me so much. And the part of the kingdom and other oil exporters. But I guess the plea I would like to add to what she said, a true expert, which I'm not in this domain, I'm a strategy guy, but just we know from history that it is possible for human beings to reliably accelerate innovation through concentrated investment and the aggregation of expertise. Now, there are a number of the business models associated with carbon capture that can be turned and made profitable and sources of growth, and that's fantastic. There are others where the public good that they create, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and not doing anything with it except burying it, but which are so important. Those are public goods in which the governments of the world, in my humble opinion, need to make a decisive investment. You know, with Operation Warp Speed in response to COVID in my country, the United States, I think we have to give credit to this demonstration of what can happen to accelerate innovation when government and the private sector work together, create the right incentives, and make those things happen. At the global level, if we could see a decisive and you know, the Manhattan Project, which of course resulted in nuclear weapons, but a Manhattan Project around removing carbon from the atmosphere, I think, is crucial. And so I just wanted to say how inspired I was, because it's true. If it's a plug in a model, as a former investment banker, a plug in a model on which no action is taken is illegitimate, and it's wrong. And to the princess's point earlier about quantification and transparency, that's the bridge. By making the change transparent and visible and measurable, by holding all accountable, but also more of global concentration of bringing together our best minds to accelerate progress, I think is an important imperative. Sorry for speaking so long.
Absolutely not. Thank you, Rudolph, for that intervention. And I think in the interest of time, maybe I'll give you each a minute to give your closing remarks. Maybe starting with Princess Nouf, and maybe Madame Tubiana, the last thing you could speak about is how certain policies in Europe, and I know this is something that you wanted to address, particularly carbon border adjustment, would be something that's actually an opportunity for the kingdom, as you know, the kingdom working on low carbon technologies and exporting low carbon or products with a low carbon footprint. How can this be an opportunity for the kingdom rather than seen as a challenge?
Well, from my experience last year when the foundation chaired the C20, we had 1,300 people from 180 countries trying to speak to the G20 because they're the most affected. And I think, as we've all been talking, if it is not a just transition, if we do not look at the statistics and the data within each country, and we talk to the people in the country that come up with solutions that is equitable to them, I think all our efforts are in vain. We cannot have this constantly keep going. You know, I've said this a few days ago. It has been like this since the 1600s, but now everybody is affected. There's health poverty, or vulnerability. You can be fine today, and you can put the air conditioning, you can pay maybe, but in a few years, the effect on the demographic of the economics of even the wealthier nations is going to change. So we need to all work on this. But again, for the most vulnerable communities, you have to bring them to the table.
Thank you, Your Highness. I think I would like to add just, you know, that we're going through a transition, and it's important that, you know, as you mentioned before, that it's, a collaborative approach and it's a smooth and orderly transition. That's, I think, why Saudi came up with the CC framework, which we are very serious about. I think, again, issues about, different countries need different approaches and different pathways are very important and need to be recognized. And again, the social and economic cost will be imperative to be addressed. And I think both, within society, within different geographies, but also within different generations. And we need to keep this, front and center when we're designing policies for the energy transition.
Thank you. Yes, I guess I take away, this has been really interesting. I guess I take away that because of the pace that the atmosphere requires, the challenges that we will see are very real, and they will require taking decisions that are costly. And those costs, we need to not compare them just to the costs of today, but to the costs of tomorrow. That's for me, I think, very central to this debate, especially for a transition that we want to be smooth and just, but to make it smooth, we are very late. So the longer it takes, the harsher it is, the costlier it is, and the bigger the trade-off, and the harder it will be for the losers to lose. So if we want to avoid that, it is now that we need to face those decisions explicitly and bring them to the table, have the conversation on, yes, we will need to transform ourselves into something entirely different, to Madame Tubiana's point, and it's going to cost us now, but it's going to cost us so much less now than it will cost if I wait for 5, 10, 15x more years.
Very quickly now, of course, one, I totally think that we have to bring people along, and the top-down policies would not work. Nowhere, in my view, nowhere. So that's very important, to choose how we, and of course that's element of social justice, but not only that, looking at the different future, and have the power of action and the agency of citizen really as an engine of change. And so it's not only the global companies, but at least the small ones and the people, etc. Again, just to build on, I think it's important for the kingdom, if I may, which is just like a friendly consideration, that it's really important to look at your future. But I do think that it is the actual discussion in your country, with really a very ambitious transformation of what could be your with the wealth base of the, and of course there are transitions, but of course you can't just switch from overnight. But it is important that, again, we can't negotiate with climate. That's the problem. And I say that to many of my colleagues, my US colleagues, or my Chinese colleagues. It's good you negotiate with each other, but that's not the point. You can't negotiate with climate. You can't make a transaction. You can't say, oh, I would do this if you do that, because that just climate cycle in the atmosphere doesn't care. So that is a very important message, because I think the diplomacy sometimes is just too focused on, if in a way, tractation and negotiation, and how can we agree on something, where the problem, the danger is for everyone. There is a very good institute, Italian institute, who just published the impact of climate change for G20 countries. And it's not the less developed countries who are still more affected. So just is a message of urgency for everyone, which I would like to convey. On the CBAM, yes, I think totally, I have sort of complex technical issue, but that could be a driver of change. If everyone finally, and I see that was a very interesting element of the negotiation on the steel agreement that US and Europe just crafted recently, and they based that on the carbon intensity of the steel, and that's the good move. And I totally share that if the kingdom would like to be the one in the clean technology, clean energy, low carbon intensity, that's the opportunity of redesigning the global markets we need. So I totally agree and happy to help on that.
Rudolph, to you.
I feel like I had my chance to close, but just very quickly, if I may, on the point of the bottom up and top down. I think data is so crucial there. One of the things that we learned from COVID was that because we don't measure the work that those who stay home with children or take care of a household do, we don't measure and compensate that work. So then when COVID hit, then the double burden placed on so many working women was incalculable and not measured. And I think there's a really powerful and useful analog in this context to really be able to quantify and understand the actual impact on individual families, communities, small businesses, so that countries can ensure that they support them through the transition as needed in a way that's genuinely equitable is crucial, because a lot of the suffering that would occur is actually invisible, and politicians, leaders don't pay a price for it. I guess that's point number one. The second point that I would just like to emphasize, however, is that the benefit of top-down approaches where it can happen is that it can also speed progress. And I guess my greatest sacred value is the agency of individual citizens to drive change. So I endorse that completely. It's just also useful because if without any top-down meeting place, that happens by itself, I think then the issue of acceleration is huge. It can take too long. So I guess I would just like to say that personally, I'm grateful that in some cases, decisive top-down action, especially when it concentrates investment to make a significant change, I think is also an important part of the puzzle. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rudolph, and thank you everyone for your participation. I'd just like to close by saying, I think we're all here at COP gathered, and I'm sure the negotiators have already had a hard time and a difficult few days. We wish them all the best. But I think beyond that, I think there's going to be a lot of work done on the bilateral side, as you mentioned, Tubiana and Mr. Fahad and everyone on the panel, actually, that there's going to be a lot of discussion on understanding how different nations are actually committing to their neutrality goals. And obviously, before talking externally with partners, countries are looking inwards. And I think that's something that the Kingdom has been doing for the past few years. And it's ready now to discuss these topics with its international partners, right? And see how we can find a way forward for collaborating with one another and harmonizing, the different policy approaches in order to achieve our common goals. And just before closing, I'd like to give you the last word.
Yeah. It's just maybe a reflection on a discussion that we'll be having tomorrow as well, is that sometimes, like you have all stated, there's a huge disconnect between what the IPCC is telling us, what the atmosphere is telling us, and between actions. And politicizing those kinds of actions sometimes gets in the way. But also, I think, like you've said, the rigor of the proof is on us, those who want to have a bold, different pathway for our transition. We have to quantify it, we have to be transparent about it, and we have all of the means, even on the finance front, where we're no longer debating ourselves as being a developing country, but we're saying we're here and we're funding our transition and we're envisioning that change. I have to say, for both Noor and myself, we were extremely humbled and electrified hearing Saudi Arabia's commitments to neutrality by 2060. Why? Not because 2060 is a good number, maybe. It might be a bit too late down the line, but that we know within the capacities of the people that we meet in our day-to-day, we have the ambition and the drive to far exceed the ambitions that have been put forth. We always, as His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz say, as Bedouins, we always commit to what we know we can do today, but always aim to achieve far beyond that in a way that probably none of us are imagining here today. So we're very excited, and hopefully this will be a space, at least with what we're trying to do with Aeon Collective, is a space where we're not having a conversation between us versus them. And it's more about this we, this collective, and how can we imagine a pathway forward. So thank you very much for joining us again today. Thank you.